Welcome to our third summer video series. We're covering the Ten Commandments, and what we're trying to bring out is how these are good news, that these are more than just commands. They're really, in a sense, God's vision for how we live in the fullest freedom through our relationship with God and our relationship to each other, with our neighbor. My name is Pastor Eric Bostrom, and this is Pastor Bree Merkle. We are from Mountain View Lutheran Church in Edgewood, Washington. And whether you're from our congregation or you're joining us from wherever you are, we're so glad that you have joined us. Today's commandment is commandment number 2, and this is, "You shall not take the Lord's name in vain." And there's a lot to unpack with this because, just the idea of, just our name, God's name, what is that about? And then just the whole idea of taking God's name or someone's name in vain. This is what we're going to dive into. And I think it's important to maybe begin with that when we teach children this commandment, I think a lot of times we just, kind of teach them very simply. This is about don't cuss. Don't say, God damn it, or whatever, those kinds of things. Or for whatever, there's, when I golf with people and they know that I'm a pastor, they joke with me, "Oh, we're golfing with the pastor, so now we can't cuss." I mean, I don't know where that comes from, but it really doesn't give us any helpful meaning for what this commandment really means something, I think, something better. And so
much deeper. It has more implication for our life.
Yeah.
Well, I think where we'd like to start today is to go back to one of the stories of when God gives us God's name. God shares God's name with us in Exodus 3. And this is the story of Moses encountering God at the burning bush.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you'll remember, Moses is going to be sent to the Pharaoh to confront Pharaoh and demand that God's people be released. And Moses essentially asks, well, who am I going to tell them sent me? Like in whose name am I going to demand that these people be freed? And God says to use God's name. And so we're given that name. And it's a really intimate moment with God and Moses. God says, "The God of your ancestors has sent me to you." And when they ask, "What is his name?" God says, "Share with them, I am who I am." And then he goes on to say, "I am the God of Abram, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So the intimacy of this moment that God has shared, revealed part of God's self, a deeper part that we have not yet known, and that God is even going to allow us to use God's name for this purpose of freeing people. So God really gives us this power, the authority to speak and to act in God's name, which I think it's at the heart of this commandment. But the challenge is, do we do that wisely? Do we do that compassionately and well when we speak and act in God's name? Are we doing that with the purposes God intended? And again, remembering that in this first case, when God gave God's name to be used, it was to free people, to liberate God's people. Is that the spirit in which we use God's name today when we throw it around sometimes?
Well, I think it's maybe helpful for us to kind of just even think about our own name and how would we feel? I mean, so if someone in our church here were to say, "Well, Pastor Eric, doesn't want, doesn't think that you're, Pastor Eric wants to exclude you. Pastor Eric doesn't want you to be around here." I would be totally heartbroken. I would be angry if someone used my name in vain like that, because I don't want my name being used in that way. I don't want my name to be used to hurt other people. I don't want my name to be used to exclude other people. And this is what God is getting at. God wants God's name to be used for for freedom, I think God wants God's name to be used for prayer and for worship. I think God wants God's name to be used for teaching. Sometimes God's name does need to be used for discipline, for admonishing, but that needs to be done, in a very healthy way, in a good faith kind of way, not in that, vengeful or, I'm just going to react and, I don't like you and I'm just going to, loosey-goosey throw on God's name just to kind of get my way. Those are the things that I think that this commandment is trying to protect us from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the framework of knowing what it's like to have our name misused is really helpful. I was trying to think of a story, an example in my life when this has happened. And when I was in 9th grade, I ran for student office for treasurer, and we had to create a platform. And so I had my platform out there, and of course they didn't get looked at typically, but one of the other people running for treasurer, read my platform and then really kind of elaborated on it and made it to sound like something it wasn't. And I can just remember being so heartbroken and devastated that someone had taken and twisted my words and my name into something that I didn't want them to be. And it was a really good lesson for me about not doing that for other people, but also, how important it is to have people who respect and honor my name. And so. Mm-hmm.
And I really feel that this is an important commandment for us, just to pay a little bit more attention to, because God's name gets thrown around a lot in our world. Yeah. And as I see it, I see God's name being thrown around a lot in politics, for example. But that always makes me squirm, because why is God's name being used? And so I want to kind of return to, I don't want God's name to be used in vain. Is it being used, for a liberating purpose? Is it used for a healing purpose? Is it used, for a building up of a community purpose? Or is it being used to divide? Is it being used to make one person or to make another person look better, and to make other people to look worse? That would be a vain use of God's name. And so,
or for, your own ambition, building up your own purposes. And unfortunately, I think that's how it gets often used in political circumstances. Is it's trying to take some of God's power and authority and give a little bit of that to ourselves, to our own stance and our issues, and right. And that's where we do remember that God's power has, God's name has power and it has an authority. So then going back to what are those proper uses of God's name.
Right. Yeah. I think in some ways, almost what, the story of Adam and Eve, where the temptation by the serpent was that, well, if you eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then you will be like God. I think one of the dangers when we misuse the name of God to serve ourselves or to serve our own purposes, it's really a way that we're trying to put ourselves in the place of God. And so I think God is, just trying to make sure that, that there's a real clear, God is God, and we're God's creatures. We're God's stewards. We're God's partners. But we're not God. And so, the proper use of God's name in prayer, in worship, in teaching, in healing, in encouraging, I guess we want to just kind of stay in those lanes and not kind of veer out of that.
Yeah.
I've always, when I'm watching a movie, someone will say, "Stop in the name of the law." And, what you're invoking authority when you do that. And I think we want to invoke the authority of God's name, in our life, but in those proper ways. Yeah. When we, because we can have an impact, in in the lives of others. We can have an impact on the world around us, by invoking God's name, but in a proper way, not in a vain way.
And that's exactly what Jesus encouraged the disciples to do, right? They were sent out to invoke his name, to invoke his power. And that's what we are called to do in our discipleship too. But there are ways to do that faithfully, and there are ways to do that that go against God's desires and God's ways for our life. And I think this is another commandment where we can see how it does tie back into that first commandment too, right? If we truly fear, love, and trust God, then we carry with us a sense of who God is and God's true intentions and work in the world. And if we can carry that with us, then we're more likely to stay in those lanes of proper uses of God's name too. How God truly wants us to use and invoke God's power in the world.
And I think that is a way that we experience freedom. I mean, it's very freeing. I mean, there is a lot of, there's a lot of hurt, in our lives and in the world. There's lots of uncertainty and doubt. There's a lot of division. But the freedom that we can feel by invoking God's name, invoking God's name, for the use of forgiveness, invoking God's name, as a powerful introduction and invitation, as hospitality, to invite people, into our faith life together. And so, the commandment is, you shall not use God's name in vain, but, it's also true, the positive, you shall use God's name for the good and proper ways. You shall use God's name, to grow and to heal and to forgive and to teach and to invite and to welcome. I think there's a lot of freedom in that.
Absolutely. So if you've liked this video today, then give it a like on the page, and you can find other videos from Mountain View of worship services and class offerings that you can tune into as well. We invite you to leave reflections and questions and comments below, and we thank you for tuning in.
And we will focus on commandment number 3 next week. Bye-bye.